already. Somebody was more anxious about cleaning up than I was. I laid my microphone on the front pew, and then it was placed in the radio station like we do after church usually. So I guess they forgot I was going to use it during Bible class. So, yeah, it's dark, so there we go. All right. Turn in your Bible to the book of Philippians. Philippians is where we're going to start. How's everybody doing? What was class on last week? Does anybody remember? Yes. It's so funny you say that because I asked Travis if he would teach class for me, and he said, yeah, I was planning on it. He said, I'm going to ask a lot of questions. Do you think they'll talk? And I said, I think we've trained them pretty well. They talk back pretty good. Did y'all talk back pretty good?
Pretty good.
All right. What kind of questions did he ask? Well, I bet he did. What sort of things did you talk about?
Who we'd like to see in heaven.
Who you want to see in heaven?
Yeah, and
What was our first recollection of the church?
Okay.
favorite songs or first songs that you remember. Who would you look up first in heaven, and who would be a Bible hero you'd want to talk to?
Okay.
Who would you like to? Well, no, I wanted to see my mom talk to Noah. I can't remember
Okay.
the question.
So it sounds like it was pretty good, pretty meaningful. That's good. All right, Philippians chapter 2 is where we're going to be. Is this rain from the hurricane, do y'all know? Or is it just plain rain? It's plain rain, okay. All right, well, I'm a loud dude. I'll do the best I can. We'll see. Philippians 2, and we're going to start. We did 12 through 14 this last time. We may still do a little bit of that as we go through. But if you recall, we talked about working out our own salvation with fear and trembling. It's one of the things we did. I remember me and your family, and my family, me and my family, these next 2 days, we're headed down to Mississippi. I'm doing a funeral of a good guy. Well, he was my friend way back when. I had lost this in your radio room.
You lost that in my radio room?
But I got it back.
Good. What are we studying? Philippians 1?
Philippians 2, 14 through 20.
Thank you.
And so that coffee smells good. But we're headed down there to do a funeral. He called me Thursday and asked me if I would do his funeral. That was the last time we had talked. And I said, well, Dale, I said, don't die during a hurricane. Hang on. And he said, well, if I could schedule this, Mark, it would be a little different. I said, well, okay. I guess that's a good enough excuse. But we're going to head down there. I think the hurricane's hitting today. So maybe all that will be past, hopefully. All right. Let's start in verse 12, and we'll read for a little bit. Therefore, my beloved, as you've always obeyed, not only in my presence, but much more in my absence, work out your salvation with fear and trembling. It is God who works in you both to will and to do for his good pleasure. Do all things without complaining and disputing, that you may become blameless and harmless, children of God without fault in the midst of a crooked and perverse generation, among whom you shine as lights in the world. Holding fast the word of life, so I may rejoice in the day of Christ, that I have not run in vain or labored in vain. And yes, if I'm being poured out as a drink offering on a sacrifice service of your faith, I am glad and rejoice with you all. For the same reason, you also be glad and rejoice with me. All right. Let's look at context again. The entire book is about joy, right? The word joy is used over 30 times in the book, word joy or some form of joy. And the book is different than any other ones in the New Testament because it doesn't cover doctrine as we think about doctrine. You read in Ephesians, you see many important doctrines. Every good and spiritual blessing comes through Christ Jesus. You see about singing, Ephesians 5:19. 1 Corinthians is full of doctrine. Philippians is more about the attitude we have and also how we get along as Christians. And there's sometimes where we think, well, that's not as important as doctrine. And you may find some churches that hammer doctrine every week. Doctrine is important. And yes, doctrine is important. But Jesus tells us also that attitude is important as well. Jesus said, by this all men will know that you're my disciples, that you have love for one another. That is one of the major identifying marks of the church, is the love that we have for one another. Now, that love has to be nurtured, has to be grown, and has to be cherished. It's very important because guess what? The church has boogers in it, right? Right? The church has boogers in it. Somebody one time was talking to me about how the church was a body, and we get that out of 1 Corinthians, right? The church is a body, and he said some people have eyes, some people are the hands of the body, some people are the foot of the body. And he said, but some people are the boogers in the nose of the body, right? And you just got to watch and not pick on them too hard, right? Well, you think about that, and it's true. Now, I don't want us to think about anybody here necessarily. But you see, even in this church, which did not seem to have major problems, you see in chapter 4, verse 2, Yoda and Syntyche, two of the ladies of the church who appear to be fairly prominent, Paul says, listen, you need to talk to these ladies, help them to get along, help them to nurture and cherish, help them to appreciate each other, help them to not damage what the church is like. And that's what we've got to do here at Benton, is always nurture and cherish each other and make ourselves be the church that Christ died for. Help us to be the church of Christ. And so you see that in chapter 1. Chapter 1, Paul says, listen, I put Christ first. I may be about to be put to death, but that's okay. Philippians 1:21, for me to live is Christ, die is gain. As long as I'm here on this earth, I'm going to preach Christ and put him first. What do you see in chapter 1? Focus. A church which is at war within itself, a church where people are always talking bad about each other, that church has lost focus. The focus needs to be on Christ and winning the world for Christ, not on just having our own needs met. Chapter 2. Chapter 2 talks about the idea of humility and putting other people first. Look at chapter 2, verse 3. Let each one of you look out not only for his own interest, but also what? The interest of other people, right? Okay? And he says, let me give you the perfect example. Jesus is in heaven, in a perfect place, perfect situation. He thought it not robbery to be equal with God. He was with God in every way, but he saw the need that we had, and so what did Jesus do? He humbled himself, and he became a servant, a man. And being found in appearance as a man, he humbled himself and became obedient to death, even to death on a cross. When he did that, of course, verses 9 through 11 tells us that God raised him up, right? But as you look at that, what I want us to notice is the example Paul gives to us. There are times where I make myself uncomfortable, and perhaps you make yourself uncomfortable by serving other people, by making sure the needs of other people are met. Now, that's what brings us to the context of what we're talking about. The other day, we looked here in verses 12 through 14, where we are to obey, not just because Paul is watching us, but even more when he's gone, because it's God who works into you. Notice the two, the duplet here. Notice the two that we're working. God works into you both to will and to do in his good pleasure. Now, what's that mean? We know what it means to do things in his good pleasure, but to will. Okay, the attitude which is there. The attitude which is there. There's an alternative reading which talks about the things which happen in life are controlled by God, and God allows things to happen in our life for his good pleasure so that we can glorify God even in our weaknesses and our problems. And that's brought out a little bit later in verse 17. All right. And so as we look there, do all things without complaining and disputing, that you may be harmless, innocent children of God in the midst of a crooked and perverse generation. All right, think about what this is like, what this looks like. You see all these things happening in a world, and you ever look around and you see a crowd that's panicked, and you see one guy who seems to be fairly, have everything together, putting things together the way that he should? Paul says that's what we're like. This world is evil. This world is trying to step on one another. This world is gossiping about one another and slandering one another. And God says, the world may be doing this all around you, but what does God want us to be? He wants us to be those who are innocent, who are loving, who are kind. He wants us to be that kind of people. showing that kind of love one to another. As lights in the world, okay? You go back in the original language here, and what he's talking about, this idea of lights in the world, is nighttime. Now, have you ever gone out to the country and looked up and seen how beautiful the lights are when you get away from light pollution, you get away from the city? I think it was 84. It was the mid-'80s. There was a time in which the power went out in L.A., Los Angeles, California. The power went out in Los Angeles, and the police received several different reports of aliens in the sky because many of the people in L.A. had never seen the Milky Way before. And that's one of those old jokes about Southern California. You know, growing up in the city where the lights are always on, you don't realize just how bright and prominent the sky is. And it's strange for us who grow up in the city and who are always around light about how powerful those lights are. Even when there's a new moon, even when the moon's not out or it's darkened, you can see when you're out in some of these areas because the lights are so very bright. Now, Paul's using this illustration to talk about this world. Now, of course, God lights the world, right? Jesus is the light of the world. But when the world doesn't have Jesus, what does the world see? You and I. We're those lights. We are the guides that can guide people in the right direction, in the right way. And that's pretty interesting, the way that he uses that. All right, when Paul speaks of being a poured out offering here in verse 17, what's he referring to? Remember in the Old Testament? About a year ago, we studied the book of Leviticus. And what you may remember about it as we studied the book of Leviticus is all the sacrifices which went on, right? Leviticus 1 through 4, you see a lot of different sacrifices. The guilt offering, the grain offering, the meat offering, all those sort of things, right? Okay. Each year on the Day of Atonement was the only day that the Israelites had to fast. Now, oftentimes they'd fast different times, but that was the day in which they were commanded. One day a year, Day of Atonement, they were to fast. And that's when the high priest would offer up the bull or the lamb, and he would bring it into the Holy of Holies, and he would sprinkle it upon the altar, upon what we think of as the Ark of the Covenant. Every year they did that. Now, that was commanded. And every year, every family, according to their wealth, had to bring a sacrifice as well. Sometimes it would be a bull. Sometimes it would be a lamb. For those who were poor, it might be a pigeon or a dove. But they were commanded to bring that sacrifice. Now, on top of that, there were also goodwill offerings. When you made a contract, oftentimes you'd bring an offering. Sometimes when you had wronged a brother or you were trying to make things better with a brother and you were wanting your brother to know that, you would make an offering. When Paul comes and brings that offering into the temple, remember in the later book of Acts, and a lot of people get angry at him, he was bringing an offering, not according to an Old Testament worshiping God. It was a guilt offering, which was showing, I want to have a good relationship with the people who are around me. Now, the people took it the wrong way. They got very angry, caused a riot, and that led Paul to being in prison and eventually heading all the way to Rome. But you see a lot of the different levels. What we see here is what's called a drink offering, in which you would have wine or you would have some precious drink which was there. And what would happen is you would pour it out to God. Now, think with me, if you will, back to the early parts of Samuel. Let me remember exactly where it is. I think it's the end of Samuel. And maybe this is a good illustration. Let me find it. Now, of course, I'm older, right? So sometimes my verses run around. Are any of y'all in here 44? I'm 44. Are you? Good job, Brent. Someday y'all know how it is. It should be right at the end of 1 Samuel. But let me find it. Well, let me tell you what happens and then maybe, I don't think it's the end of 2 Samuel. I got my Samuels mixed up. I think it's the end of 2 Samuel now. It's the mighty men. There we go. Turn to 2 Samuel chapter 23. And this is some of the background. 2 Samuel 23, what we're doing, the end of David's life, we're going over some of the big exploits. And so actually we're looking back to the days where, David is running away from Saul, right? And you ever have one of those days where you say, man, I remember where I grew up. I'd love to walk in the old home place. Or maybe I remember, we used to eat at this place or whatever else it may be. All these different things. That's kind of what's going on here. Now, let's see where we want to be. Let's start in verse 15. Context is 13, but let's start in 15. And David said with longing, oh, that someone would give me a drink of the water from the well at Bethlehem, which is by the gate. Remember, this is where he's from. He said, I remember that water. It was fresh. It was sweet. It was great. So 3 mighty men broke through the camp of the Philistines, went to that well, and they took it and brought it to David. But look what David does in verse 16. Nevertheless, he would not drink it, but he poured it out to the Lord. And he says, far be it from me, O Lord, that I should do this. Is not this not the blood of the men who went in jeopardy for their lives? And he would not drink it. All right. Now, to you and I, that sounds strange, right? These guys, they're surrounded by the Philistines. And David says, man, I'm hot. I'm tired. I remember that place where I used to get water way back when. Man, that would be awesome. And these guys are strong and powerful, and they break through the Philistine, enemy lines. And they go and they get that water. Get it from the well, bring it back to David. David gets it, and as soon as he has it, what's he do? He pours it out. Now, why would you pour it out? Would you not be hacked if you were these mighty men? After going through all that work and risking your life to get this water, and then David pours it out? What in the world? Okay. Why did David do that? It's the best he had. Okay. That's exactly it. David always gave the best of everything he had to God. When he had that water from those mighty men that went back to the well which he'd grown up in drinking, that was his absolutely most special possession that he had. And he had a rule. You always give your best to God in every situation. And so when he had this precious, precious, precious gift, he poured it out to God. It was his drink offering. All right? You see the concept there? Always give your best to God. Now, go back to Philippians 2. And what does Paul say? My life is a drink offering which is being poured out to God. How did Paul see his life? You see, it wasn't something which ended quickly. A lot of times when we think about martyrdom, we think about being burned or having our head cut off or being eaten by the lions. Paul saw that the end was coming. We see that in chapter 1. But he saw his life as being a slow pour. And the whole time it was coming, he thought, I'm going to give my best to whom? To God. Now, I look at my life. You look at your life. Life is passing away. I made a joke a second ago about being 45. I think most of y'all may have passed that. A couple of you may have lapped it, right? As we look back at our life, think about your life being a holy sacrifice to God. It's kind of biblical, Romans 12:1, right? And it's not just a one-time thing when you think about the day in which you're baptized. It's a continual life process. Part of it was when you were baptized. Part of it was when you finished your education in school. Part of it was when you started a family and had that family and tried to raise those kids. Part of it's when those kids moved out. Part of it is when you struggle in life and things happen. Part of it is just the everyday monotony which is there. And what Paul is saying here is my life is being poured out as a sacrifice to God. See that concept there? All right. Now bring it back to context with what we're talking about in the book of Philippians, and especially in chapter 2. Paul has just said Jesus is a perfect example of how our life is sacrificed one to another, right? Have the attitude, have that mind which is in Christ, chapter 2 and verse 5. Now Paul says, look at my life. And I want you to see that my life is a constant pouring out and a sacrifice. All right, what are some examples? Acts 16. Paul is beaten by a Philippian jailer, thrown into the inner stocks of a prison for something that he was not guilty of. When the earthquake happens, the man confesses. What does Paul do to this man who very likely had locked him up? Preaches the gospel to him, and at midnight he baptizes he and his family. All right, now is that a level of forgiveness? I would say it was. His life is a pouring out of a not wanting my rights necessarily all the time, but in a surrendering of myself for the sake of Christ. Okay? Now, apply that to our life today. When you have issues and problems going on in the church, our life is a constant pouring out, a constant sense of service to God. When someone does something against you, what did the apostles do in Acts 4 and 5? They went on their way rejoicing because they had been found worthy of suffering for the cause of Christ. And so every part of our life, in that sense, is a sacrifice. And think of it being poured out slowly. Now, some people pour it out more quickly than others. We're amazed at how quick it goes. Some people, it's poured out slowly. But we're all, each and every day, is a present given to God. Correct? You see how that works? Okay. So, in thinking of that, what are some ways that you sacrifice to God? You don't put a goat on the altar. But what are some ways that you sacrifice to God? Time, okay. Not just with church, but in all these other ways of serving one another, like we talked in the sermon, James 1:27, okay. What's another thing? Missions, okay. Whether it's us going ourselves, whether it's supporting others who go, whether it's prayer, money, yeah. The way you live our life, absolutely. Talking about money, our giving is oftentimes talked about a great aroma that comes up before the throne of God. The way we give our life, the decisions we make. Good point. Okay, what are some other ways? Yeah. Oh, yeah. We got the food bank. And so every other Monday, we have a lot of people up here, and we're able to help folks. I think sometimes it's reached up to about 50 families we've helped in a week. Okay, not always that many, but oftentimes it's a lot more people in this county poor than you would think looking around. A lot more people struggling than ought to be. Okay? What's another way in which we sacrifice? Marilyn, you feeling okay? Huh? Are you feeling okay? I have not heard you since I've come back. Okay. Well, I was just checking. Right. Absolutely. Yeah. He does a lot of work, doesn't he? That's true.
Somehow this woman ended up having to take him out of a bad situation. So she put on Facebook that he was about Bryce's age but needed clothes.
Mm-hmm.
You can't believe all the churches that they put down saying this one does clothes on Monday night, and this one does clothes, and this one does money, and this one. And I said it was just amazing to see how much in the county. And
How many people help folks? Yeah. Yeah, it's fascinating seeing how many people help people. Absolutely.
This little boy dumped in her lap and had no clothes, no nothing for him.
That's right. What you got, Brent?
Sacrifice of comfort.
Okay.
Growing up as a preacher's kid, we moved, and we didn't have the benefit of attending the same school, growing up. So, it was a sacrifice to be able to move around to different places for Dad to preach the gospel, and the same for my little brother. I mean, he took his family to Tanzania for 3.5 years.
Right.
But, there's some sacrifice there that we.
Yeah. And there's times where we have to do things that are uncomfortable. Especially you see that in a preacher's family, but you see it in other ways as well, Okay, that's a good point.
Faithful church attendance and bringing up your children in the nurture and admonition of the Lord.
That's right. Being here at church, even when it's inconvenient, right? I'm tickled we had a decent number. It's amazing when fall break happens how many people are gone. I think 4 years ago, I went down to the Gulf Coast down there in Alabama and went to the congregation down there, and there were over 100 members from Marshall County in that church. And it's hilarious because the people down there every year forget the fall break's coming. And so, had 25 down there? Yeah. I knew the former preacher down there. I guess he's 2 or 3 preachers ago. His name is Mark. We know each other. He's up in Spokane, Washington now. But he would talk about how every once in a while people would say, the church here isn't very friendly. And he'd always say, we have 120 members, but a regular attendance of 400 during the summer. And he said, so all these people coming in saying nobody's talking to us is because they're sitting only with visitors. He would talk about that. And he was always talking about how it's kind of weird to set budgets or whatever else. Well, that church was back down to 120 members, but for some reason in the fall, they always almost triple in size because Marshall County has fall break. And so they have to run back there and fix the Lord's Supper, fix a lot more of it and everything else. But it's interesting seeing how that happens. That's an interesting concept as you look at it and see it go on. Okay, it's verse 18, for the same reason, you also be glad and rejoice in me. I think verse 18 says just as much as 17, although we skip over it. Paul says, I want you to realize I lose my comfort. I lose my time. I've spent my money. I've spent my life. I've sacrificed. But what's Paul's attitude? He says, I want you to, here's that word again, rejoice with me in that we have an opportunity to do it. You remember, and maybe some of us remember more with grandkids than you do with children, how when you get them something, even if it's expensive, the joy that you find at Christmas when they get to open up that present and it's the exact thing that they wanted, right? Or maybe for your spouse, you've bought them a present or you've done something and the joy comes to you just as much. Now, they're happy because they got the present, but the joy comes with you because, wow, I got them this thing, and this is exciting. I love to see them happy. I love to see those things met, right? Okay? That's the attitude Paul's talking about here. Paul says, I'm suffering. Here he is in a prison as he's writing this, okay? Using this word rejoice over and over and over. And yet, although he's suffering, he says, I want you to know I am happy to have the opportunity to be able to do it. I am happy to have an opportunity to be able to take a back seat and put somebody else up there. To be able to say, I may have a right, but I want somebody else to be served. I want somebody else to be noticed. I want somebody else to receive the praise which is there. Now, if you're looking for a formula of a church full of love, the very first ingredient is people who serve and love and lift up one another. And that's the culture we need to push. That's the culture we need to nourish. A church that loves, a church which helps, a church that encourages, a church where we can be real with one another, where we pray with one another, where we help one another, and all these things, right? Okay? So here's my question. Y'all are experts. Been members of the church a long time. How do we create that church? Starts with one person doing the right thing. Absolutely. Okay? And that person is? Yeah, every one of us. Okay? All right? The old sermon from way back when. What do you want the church to be? Imagine if everybody in this church was just like you. Right? Ooh, the singing would be rough, right? No. Imagine if everything in this church was just like me. In a way in which I greeted people when I came in, and the enthusiasm I have when I'm at church, and the way that I treat other people, what would this church be like? It starts with us, okay? So you have that aspect. Now, what else? The aspect of the individual responsibility of each one of us. What else do we do to nurture that culture? Okay, everyday life. Okay. To be those stars in the night which light up the world even in the darkness which is here. Okay, get together. Especially times outside of church. Fellowship meals are important. Times where we spend outside of church are important, right? We're together. We know we got our ties on and you got to act churchy, right? But you get to meet other people, get to really know other people outside of this building. Very true. Okay, what else? Be happy instead of pessimistic. Oh, is the world ever pessimistic? All the stinking time, right? And I think I brought this up. Voltaire, who was in the French Revolution many centuries ago, a vowed atheist, always would tell people that by the end of his life, the Bible would be nothing more than a dusty book left in a museum that nobody would know of. Well, how many of us have read Voltaire's works? Very, very few of us, but we still have the Bible today, don't we? But he said, here's the number one argument against Christianity. And the number one argument he would bring out every time he was in a debate is he would say, if God is real, if Jesus really existed, why do people in the church look like they do? Why do they all look like they just sucked on a lemon? And why are they always so negative and angry with one another? That was his number one argument against Christianity. Okay? Well, looking at the church today, do we all look like we just ate a lemon? Dour? I get to watch y'all every Sunday. Y'all don't look that way. Now, sometimes y'all look a little tired. But not really. We're a happy church, and that's good. And we need a happy church because guess what? Everywhere you go, people are unhappy. At work, there's never enough profit, never enough things done, and so people are unhappy. You got to get out on the ball field. The people who lost are unhappy. The people who won are still unhappy half the time, right? Do you go to families and you see families which are full of conflict? People need a happy place, and this needs to be the happy place. That doesn't mean that we're always excited, laughing, and whatever. There's sometimes where we grieve, but it needs to be a place where we love and we show Christian joy, even in our sacrifice. Okay? What else? Right. Oh, we do. We do. What she said is you think about the early church, people being fed to the lions, people being persecuted. Look how lucky we are today. That's very true. Even looking through Restoration history, even in our country, back in 17 and 1800s, looking at the suffering which they did and the difficulties, okay? We're almost done. Do any of y'all date back far enough where they used to worship like in a brush arbor? Have you ever worshiped in a brush arbor? Yeah. Okay. All right. I figured we'd have some of those. Worship in some of these old buildings. You go over to Middle Tennessee, East Kentucky, Mulkey and Canes Ridge and stuff. One of the things you'll notice is on the side of the building, there are these long sticks. Ushers used to have a job. What was that job? They'd have a stick, and when people fell asleep, they'd get to whack them. Now, first of all, I bet they had a lot more volunteers to be ushers than we do, right? But secondly, imagine, church is pretty good nowadays.
Sun Road Church in Crogana
Yeah.
has a deacon, and that's his job.
That's the deacon's job.
I've watched him do it.
There you go.
Oh, being asleep, he'd hit her on the head.
Whack them. Okay. Thanks for being here. See you tonight.